Hey guys, and welcome to the Alabama Saltwater Fishing Report, the first podcast to bring you the local inshore, offshore, and onshore fishing report, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. I'm Butch Theory, and due to the busy nature of the season and just this time of year in general, I know you guys know how crazy it can be with jobs and family and traveling and everything else. Joe and I are going to do something a little different this week for you. Thank you to our producer, Johnny Gwynn at Deep Fried Studios. He's put together an awesome Inshore Special segment. It's going to be a Hey Cap Inshore Special this week. And we hope you guys all had a Merry Christmas and looking forward to ringing in the new year with a report next week in 2020. Hope you guys keep whacking them. We'll talk to you soon. All right, Captain Bobby, we got the Hey Cap question for you again this week.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, this week, Richie Ellison is going to get the Fairhope rattle. Make sure you email us at alabama@bestfishingreport.com to redeem that. Richie Ellison says, "Hey, Cap, every year it seems like I spend too much time chasing turkeys and miss the big trout window. What is the ideal window for big trout, and when do our trout spawn?"
That's a great question. First of all, I don't think you miss it by going turkey hunting. I think you miss some of it, but you're not totally missing it. You know, Patrick catches fish in the dead of winter, which is way out of the spawning period. He catches giant ones. I'm not going to say where, but I'll just say parts north, in the dead of winter. And some of the biggest trout I've ever caught have been in the late spring and early summer. And if I had to say it, the turkey hunting season, which is, typically March and part of April, you're at the very early part of that spawn. I think I'm leaning more towards more like late April, May, June, but they'll start spawning in March and spawn all the way through late September into October. As long as the water temperatures are over 62, they're in spawning mode. What makes the fish bigger in the early part of the spawn is they continue to spawn. The roe sacks actually get smaller, so when you're catching you'll still be catching the spawning fish in September. But if you look at the roe sacks, of that same fish in May, for example, or April, it's going to be the size of a cigar. Where you catch that same fish in September, it'll be the size of a pencil, and so that's where that weight's added. You're catching the same fish, but the weight goes up because that roe is so dense. So the answer to your question is you're really not missing it, and especially if you're just turkey hunting, man. I'd set down your turkey gear and grab you a topwater or a slick lure and get after it in late April, early May, and don't quit until Patrick, right. Till December, until turkey hunting season comes around again or whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, trout fish from May to January, and you'll be good.
Richie Ellison cannot use turkey hunting as an excuse to not big trout anymore.
Hey, Butch, you said that, not me, man.
That's right.
I'm trying to make the poor guy feel better,
Yeah, definitely can echo what Bobby's saying about that spawn, starting in late April, going all the way into September. But, Bobby, something that I have noticed in my experience is we actually have a really big spawn in August, and I've seen some of the catch or some of the stock assessment data from the marine resources that shows that May and August are actually two of the biggest spawns that we'll see in speckled trout. I don't know what really stimulates that, but I have caught 23-inch 6.5 pound trout in the month of August, and it was all because of the roe. So
that's exactly right. And that's where the weight, like you just said, that 23-inch fish, and you catch that during January or something, it's probably going to be a 3.5 pounder. You know what I'm saying, or a 4 pounder at the most.
But best, yeah.
And I know what you're saying. And actually, I caught one of the biggest trout. I've caught a handful of what I consider real big trout in my life. And one of them was this past year the weekend after Labor Day. You know what I'm saying? It was one of the biggest trout I've ever caught. So, again, to the point is I don't think you're missing it just because you're turkey hunting.
That's a great Hey Cap question. He did mention in the end of his question, he said he fishes Eastern Shore, Weeks Bay, and Fort Morgan Marsh. That's the same, right? That's all the same spawn pattern and all that, or am I wrong?
Oh, yeah. Everything in our system's the same. Really, everything on the northern Gulf Coast is the same.
Right.
So anything in the Mobile Bay system you're gonna be right there with all of that. Exactly what we were just talking about. So it doesn't matter.
I thought so. I just wanted to leave it up to you experts to say whether that was related or not, because I left that out of the question.
Well, you got the expert in the studio. I'm just out here on the phone for you. But yeah, I know what you're saying.
As always, we appreciate you contributing. And thanks, Richie Ellison. Make sure you email us at alabama@bestfishingreport.com to get your Hey Cap questions in. This week's Hey Cap question is brought to us by KillerDock. You know, we've talked at length on here about the dock dysfunction that has affected us for years. The good news is that our suffering has finally come to an end. KillerDock brings a dock enhancement that not only will put an end to your dock dysfunction, it will make being on your dock enjoyable again. KillerDock combines durability, function, and design to uniquely upgrade your entire dock experience. To check out the greatest fish cleaning stations known to mankind, visit KillerDock.com to check it out for yourself. Captain Richard Rutland's old cold-blooded fish. You are the going to answer the Hey Cap question this week. We have an old friend of ours. Vic called me all fired up about this last week. He said, I'm going to send you a Hey Cap question. So Vic Johnson asks, and Vic Johnson is going to be the recipient of that Fair Hope rattle this week. Thanks for your question, Vic. Vic emailed us at alabama@bestfishingreport.com to get his question in. When riding around looking for slicks, how can you tell the difference in an actual trout slick and what I call a phantom slick? And can you explain fishing trout slick technique?
So to answer that question, I tell you what's funny about slicks is most of the time you find slicks when you're in transit, you know, when you're running from one place, from point A to point B, you know, from one fishing spot to another.
Right.
And most of the time I smell the slick before I even see it. They kind of have everybody says they smell like watermelon. And once you smell one, you get a nose for it. I always kind of joke around with people whenever I smell that smell, I kind of get aroused, you know. I always say I wish they could put that stuff in a can so I could just walk around my house spraying it everywhere, you know.
You know, it's about to be on.
No, hold on a minute now. I'm calling complete BS on this. This is like, I can totally see Richard out on the boat. He's like, y'all smell that slick? Like, he saw the slick like 10 minutes ago, but he's just trying to, you know, really have some showmanship for his client. Y'all smell that slick?
Man, I'm telling you, man, I'm like,
and then they catch a fish and you're like, I need that. Let me get that tip, guys. Don't forget about that tip.
I'm like a bird dog smelling a bird in the field, man. Whenever I smell one of those slicks, I stop and point. You know, I do.
He's up on the bow, shorts on, smelling them.
So something that Vic asked was about a phantom slick. Okay, so we have things. You know, we have slicks all the time, and what I call them wind slicks. You know, and most of the time you'll have like a bank or something like that, or a point. And you'll see this great big long, you know, sometimes it looks like it's a mile long looking slick, and it's real thin and slender and long. And that's a wind slick, and you want to ignore those. A true fish slick is going to be usually round or oval in shape. And it almost has like a little bit of a different shimmer to it as well on the water when you're looking at them. But when you see one or smell one, and then see where it is, the wheels start turning, and I start asking myself questions. Okay, well, where is that slick happening? What is the water depth over there? What structure might be on the bottom? What's causing that? Because a lot of times you'll be like around crab traps or something like that, and sometimes I'll associate seeing a slick with a line of crab traps if a crabber just came by and changed all of his bait out and emptied them and put them back in the water or whatnot. And so you got to ask yourself a few questions to start out with, to why the slick is there and where it's located. And then as far as setting up on it, I like to look at where it is, take note in the current, which way the water's moving, and then which way the wind is blowing, because the fish are going to be upwind and or up current from where you see the actual slick. So you got to kind of think about it and assess the situation before you just go to fishing. A lot of people, I've seen a lot of people, they just want to go fish right where the slick is. And I'm always like, no, you need to throw up here, up current, upwind from them. And another thing too about slicks that I see a lot is I call them whiffs. A lot of times when you're on fish or in a fishy area, you'll see a slick pop up, and it's literally there for about a minute, and then it just goes right away. Some of them pop up, and they'll pop up the size of the bed of your truck, and then before you know it, they're 18 times that size, you know, and it's real spread out and big. So, you know, paying attention to those little things sometimes clues me into where a school of fish might be, and I'll adjust my drift or where I'm anchored at to move over in front of them.
You're talking about those slicks, and that happens a lot out on these flats that you're talking about, whether it's shell beds and whatnot. Do you have an approach? Like how spooky are these fish out on these flats with regards to, you know, your hull slapping the water, your
Power pole going down?
Yeah, anything that you're using, trolling motor, all that kind of stuff. How much, you know, how wide do you need to give them a berth if you're trying to get, say, upwind or up current of a slick or a fishy area?
So I always say that you need to use the lightest means necessary to get to the fish. Okay, so I pretty much always use the wind to my advantage to kind of push the boat whenever I go fishing. So you see a slick, and say you're lucky when you see it and you're 100 yards away from it. Okay, I'm gonna keep about 150 yard distance from where I think the fish are, and I'll usually make a great big loop and get upwind as far as I can, and then kill the big engine, get on the trolling motor, and then just kind of slowly drift right into where the fish are. And then when you get a bite, or if you want to stop and focus on an area a little bit, you know, either power pole down or slip your anchor in the water and give it a little bit, and then pick back up and move along that way. Fish are very, very, very spooky in shallow water, and especially when you're talking about oyster shells, because oyster shell, you know, if you've ever walked on an oyster shell bottom, it's as hard as concrete. You just have to imagine that every sound,
it's going to carry
every sound and everything that's happening is reverberating through the water, so it's going to be a lot more
amplified.
You know, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly the word I was looking for.
Yeah, I got your back on it. Well, what about them redfish, Richard? Do they produce a slick as well whenever they start feeding pretty hard?
Yep, they sure do. Pretty much all fish create some kind of slick, I think, when they're feeding, you know. And what's happening with that, what's causing that slick is all fish, when they eat, they're not nibbling and chewing things up like we do when we eat our food. They just inhale the entire bait directly down into their stomach. And when they do that, they inhale a bunch of water. And so some water goes in their stomach, and they have to regurgitate some of that water out of their stomach. And that's what's causing the slick, is some of that stomach acid and stuff coming out of their stomach. You know, one thing that really tells me that that's exactly what's happening is that every once in a while, whenever I'm taking a speckled trout off of a hook or whatnot, and I'm holding it there, and the fish is kind of upwind of me, I get a whiff of that watermelon smell that we're talking about from the fish. So that's why that's happening.
That's really cool. That makes a lot of sense.
It's cool. Yeah, man. You know, I've heard, I've even heard guys that tuna fish talk about getting out there around tuna and stuff like that, and they'll see slicks pop up, you know, and so that, you know, you can just tell that fish are in the area and the fish are feeding. That's all a slick is telling you, that there's feeding fish in the area.
I can attest to the tuna slicks. They do have a smell, but I'm not sure that it's watermelon.
Yeah, it might not be watermelon. That's just how the speckled trout usually smells to me. But but anywho, man, that's pretty neat.
Honeysuckle. It's honeysuckle.
Honeysuckle.
Tuna fish slicks smell like honeysuckle. Tuna fish I can smell them. I can smell them from at least a mile away.
That's neat.
All right.
No, that's good stuff, man. I'm still learning this inshore game as well, and I enjoy fishing with you and fishing with Bobby. And last time with Bobby, we fished a good bit of those slicks in the Mississippi Sound, and I learned a lot from him that day.
It's something to definitely take note of. You know, you just never know where you're going to find a school of fish, and that's just a telltale sign of where some fish are actually feeding. The bad news about slicks is they don't tell you what size fish they are. You know, 'cause a lot of times you'll see all these slicks popping up all over the place, and you pull in there, and it's 5 zillion 12-inch trout. You know,
hey, that's all right. That works too.
I still can't get the picture out of my mind of Richard Rutland or Rouse driving his boat to find this.
Ooh, man, you want to talk about fun, bro? I mean, that's that gets me fired up.
That's right.
Me real fired up.
No matter how big they are, the tug is the drug. Whenever you find fish, you found fish.
That's it. A tug is a drug. I stole that one from you, man. That's I like that saying.
For sure.
Thank you, sir. All right, Patrick, you got the Hey Cap question this week. Patrick Hatta is going to be getting the Fairhope rattle popping cork. He says, "Hey Cap, how does the moon phase determine your fishing method?" Method being, the type of bottom to look for, the area, specific area or bait to look for, specifically pre and post full or new moons and in between moons. Man, that's a lot of variables there. Let me just go back to that, Patrick. How does the moon phase determine your fishing method?
Well, how does the moon phase determine my fishing method is I will fish prior to both the new and the full moon. I want to target the areas I feel most confident targeting big fish, whether it's big trout or big redfish. I feel like those two fish in particular are most affected by the moon. So if it becomes situational, it becomes conditional, where early in the year or early in the summer, I feel like lower end of the bay in the Mississippi Sound around the beaches and stuff like that, I'm going to find the most active speckled trout and redfish. So those are going to be the areas that I'm going to target, and I want to fish fairly aggressive with big baits to try to target big fish. And then once you get behind the moon, it seems like everything, it's like a big party and everybody's freaking going crazy before the moons. And then as soon as it's over, it's like all the fish kind of have a hangover, and they're not looking to do much of anything. I'm sure most people can relate to what a hangover feels like, and I feel like that's where the fish are post full moon and new moon. And the way to get those bites a lot of times is going to be a more of a finesse style, slower baits, and maybe even smaller baits, and make it easier for the fish to attack your baits and make the connection there. As far as like wear and style, bottom structure and reefs and all that, man, I wish I had all those details put together, because it'd make it a whole lot easier. But a lot of it I go with situations based on where, almost every day. And I know Bobby and Richard and we talk about it a lot, where we have to go condition wise or wind wise, or, and go where we can go. So I don't know that I had the exact answer on what type of structure or whatever I would fish on, but I would say before the moons, you can go big or go home kind of attitude. And on the backside, you're going to have to be a little bit more finesse.
All right, Patrick. I like it.
All right, guys. Thank y'all.
And let's go see what old Captain Richard Rutland's doing with cold-blooded fishing. About that Hey Cap question, Joe.
The Hey Cap quiz this week. It's coming from Rusty Staggs. He emailed us. I like that name.
I like it.
That is a good name. I like that name a lot.
My second son, if I have one, Rusty. All right. Rusty Staggs emailed us at alabama@bestfishingreport.com. He's got a good one this week. Rusty says, "What kind of rods, Richard, specifically action and power, and how many do you need to fully equip an inshore boat to cover all different types of fishing, such as popping corks, artificials, grubs, etc.? What do you think, man?"
Well, first of all, I don't think there's a boat on earth that would have enough rod holders for me to put all of those rods in.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I need a different rod for every single lure I throw. But I kind of break it down like this. You go live bait, artificial, and then we're talking about bottom fishing. On live bait, I tend to like a much softer action rod. So meaning that it's not real stiff. It has a lot of give in it. The blank is going to bend all the way through the rod down to the handle. And the reason I like that is because when we're using like popping corks and then like just maybe tight line and croakers or something like that, when you have to use these little bitty hooks, and when you get the hook in the fish's mouth, the softer the action is, the more it's going to absorb the shock of the fish making long runs and shaking his head and coming to the surface. And I feel like that's definitely going to keep the hook buried, especially in a trout's mouth, better more so than like redfish or other species, because trout's mouths just have all this really soft tissue that likes to rip and tear and all that. And the more he does all the head shaking and running and stuff, the bigger the hole's going to get that the hook is in, and the more likely it is to shake out. So starting with a popping cork and a slip cork, I like a little bit longer rod, about at least a 7 foot. All of mine are 7.6, and I like that because you get you can cast it a lot farther, and you also when you go to set the hook, the rod comes around a little faster, so you get tight on the fish a little quicker. So I would say a medium to medium light on your popping cork and slip cork rod, or like a tight line rod. So medium to medium light, and then a moderate fast tip is what I would say as far as the action goes. Then when you switch over to artificial, you want something that's going to be a little bit more limber, a little stiffer, has a fast to an extra fast action. And I still stay at a medium, maybe a medium heavy power. And the reason you want that is so that you can feel everything that's going on with the lure when you're retrieving it. Sometimes these bites that you're getting, some of these fish are real light, and that having the action a little faster is going to help you feel that bite. And then when you set the hook, you're going to drive the hook into the fish's jaw or to some type of bone. So when I go like to the store and load up like the tip of a rod, I'll usually stand the rod straight up and load the tip. On an artificial rod, I want to see only about the top third of the rod bending. You don't want to see the bottom section of the rod. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And as far as length on the artificial rods, a lot of guys will go shorter than 7 foot, to like a 6'9", 6'10". Like I said, more a fast to extra fast, and that's going to be your shorter rods are going to be what you want to use maybe for a grub, where you have a nice wide gap hook. You set the hook in a fish, you don't really have to worry about them shaking off. When you start to get into throwing hard baits, top water, stuff like that, you want to go a little bit softer on those rods. You don't want those to be quite as stiff, because you're dealing with treble hooks there again, and you're running into the same thing I was talking about with live bait, where you can start to tear holes in their mouth and shake hooks loose. And as far as length, going forward with from grubs, I'm pretty much about a 7 foot to 7'3", 7'4" in length. So and then bottom fishing's the next one. I kind of think the same way about bottom fishing that I do about live baiting with my popping cork and slip cork rods. I want them soft. I want the rod to bend and absorb the pressure of the fish, so that you're not, you don't want to feel when you're catching a snapper or an amberjack or something like that. You don't want to feel like you're fighting the fish on a 2x4. I want to feel like you're, the rod's absorbing a lot of the head shaking and running and all that kind of stuff. It seemed like back in the day, I used to use like braided line and a real stiff rod. And it seemed like I usually broke a lot of fish off that way, or pulled a lot of hooks off. And I switched over to mono and a softer rod, and it made all the difference in the world as far as getting fish off the bottom, getting them to the boat.
Funny to hear you say that. I've got a small Abbott reel that I use on a really limber rod for deep dropping. And a lot of people laugh at me because, this thing just bows over. It doesn't matter what you catch, it's going to put a big bow in it. But because I've got that heavyweight braid on there, and I can crank the drag down, so I'm not really letting much line out, and the limber nature of that rod gives just enough that I'm not wearing a hole in that fish's mouth. And it works like a charm, but it's exactly, opposite of what I grew up bottom fishing with, So I think with braided line, and I like what you're saying about the limber nature of the rod giving and letting that be some of your drag, because that's important. I'm going to take this one step further, though, Richard. If I'm wade fishing, I'm only carrying one rod with me. So if I'm taking one rod and I'm going to throw a top water early, and then I'm going to switch over to a slick lure, or maybe switch over to a grub, what's your all-around go-to rod if you got to take only one?
I just think about one of the rods in my arsenal right now, and it's a 7'3". Of course, I build on my own rods, so I don't have brands I can spit out there at you. But it's a 7'3", and it's a extra fast, medium power rod, and it's definitely something you can that I kind of use all purpose. It's not my most favorite rod to throw a grub with, but definitely like throwing slicks and top waters with it, because it's got enough backbone to where you get a bite on a slick lure, you can really get a good hook set in them and keep them tight. And then when you using top water early in the morning, I can back off of my drag a little bit and has enough flex in the tip to where you're not ripping the lure out of the fish's mouth when you get him on there. It's all a balance, you know what I mean? It's kind of like the perfect boat does not exist. Everybody wants a boat like an inshore boat that'll run 65 miles an hour and just blow right across Mobile Bay in a 4-foot chop and float in 12 inches of water, and that just doesn't exist. So you give up one thing for another. It's the same way with a fishing rod. There's a compromise in there that you have to live with. For sure. And a lot of that comes down to playing the fish back in too. How you set your drag and how you reel the fish in, kind of playing them in, not putting too much pressure on them, or being able to put enough pressure on them to keep them hooked up.
I like it. Yeah, I mean, you got to ask yourself, what are the 80% of the conditions that you're doing? And if funds are limited, you want to get a rod that can handle 80% of the stuff and be good at it, and then maybe be mediocre at the other 20%. You're just not doing it as much. So, man, that was right. Yeah, I like that.
I could keep on going too, man. You know me. I'm definitely into the gear. I have a rod dedicated to every type of application that I'm going to do. Now, a lot of my rods end up being multi-purpose rods, but then there's some rods I can only use for certain applications. It's only going to work for either like a top water or a popping cork, or it's only going to work for a grub situation or something like that. So there's definitely a method to the madness, I guess you'd say. And I've picked that up a lot from the bass world. The bass guys, they're that way. That's how they're programmed, and just picking up little things from them has made me a better rod builder and angler.
Richard, thanks for the report, buddy.
Cool, man. Y'all, thanks for having me. I'll see y'all next time.
Thanks, Richard. Keep whacking them.
So, Patrick Garmison with Ugly Fishing.
Yes, yes, sir.
You have the Hey Cap question. This week's Hey Cap question is, the winner of the Fairhope Rattle Pop and Cork this week is Jeff Ferguson. Jeff emailed us at alabama@bestfishingreport.com, and he says, "Hey Cap, can you tell us some of the different ways of hooking live shrimp for different species and different fishing techniques? For instance, do some species of fish typically attack a live shrimp from the head versus the tail? What are some of your different rigging techniques for different structure and depths? And specifically, what is the best way to hook a live shrimp on a jig head, and what situations would you use this technique?" It's a multi-part question, so let's just kind of break it down and go piece to piece. What you think, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, Patrick, so break that down. Start out, let's just talk popping corks. Any reason to hook them any differently than horn hooking them?
The only time I would go other than a horn hook on a shrimp under a popping cork is if it's softer and it's horn hooking them, it seems like they'll fall off immediately. You can tail hook them and maybe get one cast out of it before it falls off. So if you're on a good bite, you can tail hook a softer shrimp and get that cast out there, get the shrimp in front of the fish and get you one on the hook. If the shrimp is small, too small for the hook size that you're using, where the barb of the hook is actually going to shatter the horn or shatter the shell of the shrimp, then tail hook it just so you can be able to get some use out of it. So that's be it on the popping cork.
Let's talk slip cork next.
Slip cork, always go horn because of what we were talking about earlier. I want want that presentation to be that shrimp swimming forward with the current, and he's and you know, the current and the cork and everything's kind of pulling that shrimp along, but it's pulling it forward as he's naturally going to be swimming. Now, you know, everybody thinks about a shrimp on its escape method is going in reverse. He's going backwards, but we're not sending a shrimp down there and dragging him backwards and making a good presentation. So horn hooking your slip cork shrimp is a must.
What about fishing the jig head? I'm really interested to hear what you say on this.
So I haven't seen a whole lot of times where I've gone this method, but what I have done is for using it for sheephead sometimes. And what I'll do is I'll bite the tail off the shrimp and run the hook up the body of the shrimp and out through just before you get to his bigger legs. I don't know what the larger legs are called, but basically bringing that hook out through its actual tail and kind of thread it. It's backwards, but it works. I mean, for sheephead, and it would work for redfish too. So and it'll stay on the hook really well. And the shrimp will actually, because you're not hitting any vital organs with the hook, they'll actually stay alive for several casts like that. Also flounder, it would work like that too. They're not too picky on what direction a shrimp is moving.
So if you're fishing a live shrimp on the bottom, you recommend, like, if you're bumping it along the bottom like you would if you were, you know, bumping it for a flounder or something like that, tail hooking it always then?
No, I mean, typically I'm going to horn hook a shrimp first, but if you're doing the jig head thing, then that would definitely be the best and cleanest method on that shrimp would be to run that hook up its tail. And it works out for sure.
All right. What about you mentioned earlier the split shot rig? You're horn hooking them. You mentioned that. What about a free line? You do anything different with a free line?
So if it's no current, very little to no current, then horn hook it, and then you can. That's gonna be my primary method. Is gonna be to horn hook them. But if you have a little bit of current that you're trying to actually feed your bait down, you can tail hook him, and he'll actually swim away from you. So you can kind of leave a little bit. You know, like, so you give it a little bit of slack and let that shrimp do his own swimming, and then you can tighten it up and pull him backwards a little bit, and it'll cause them to want to swim away from you again. So that, you know, you could utilize either technique there.
All right, you know you're not going to get out of here without me asking about triple tail. What do you do when you see a triple tail?
If I see a triple tail, when I see them, I'm breaking out the popping cork, and I'm going to tail hook that shrimp near that very last segment before the tail. It's a little bit harder shell right there and a lot harder to sling off the hook. So that's the only thing I'm worried about, is getting nervous and my guys going up there and slinging the shrimp off the hook when we got the perfect shot at the triple tail. So nothing worse than firing a bait off. That's my method there, is just the best, most effective way to keep that shrimp on the hook.
Well, a favorite point of contention whenever I'm triple tail fishing with my dad is how to hook the shrimp. So
all right,
since I believe my way is the best way, I'm gonna interject here. We like to fish triple tail on slip corks. You know, you're fishing a lot of structure, and those fish are submerged. You don't see them a lot of the time, and you need to get very close to that structure. Most fishermen tend to think like with speckled trout or something like that, you know, as long as I'm fairly close to that structure, that fish will swim out there and eat it. And sometimes they will, but the majority of the time, you've got to get that bait right on that buoy chain, that piling, that channel marker. You got to get it right in front of that fish, especially if the current's running hard. So you take your tail hook a step further. Put the barb of that hook up through the last segment of the shrimp, run it all the way up to the eye of the hook, and then embed that hook back into the body of the shrimp and make it weedless, just like you would if you were fishing like a slick lure.
This is
And
that's professional status.
Well,
I'm in the rookie status when it comes to triple tail fishing.
Well, what this prevents is that when that bait drifts up to the piling or the buoy chain or whatever it is, you can actually let that bait get on the other side of the piling. If that current's running, you let it get on the other side of the buoy chain. And when you go and try to pull that cork and pull that bait away from that buoy, it'll just, if you don't wait too long and let it get away on the other side, you can actually pull that bait around the buoy chain or around the piling, and it won't hook onto the piling.
Oh my God, Joe, you're blowing my mind here.
Well, I mean, it saves you a lot of trouble, because if you fish that kind of stuff long enough, you've been hooked on the piling.
Pretty much every fish that we ever try to catch, we're hooked on the crab trap line. So
right.
This is absolute gold, Joe. I will now, I promise you, I will up my triple tail catch by the time the next episode rolls.
There's your tip.
Said anything?
That's right.
So you're the man.
Well, Patrick, thank you, man. That was
absolutely.
You just stole my thunder. Actually, I think the whole show needs to be.
You got to understand, this has nothing to do with actually helping people. It has everything to do with proving my dad wrong. So, Emery, if you're listening, I win. Patrick, great report,
stuff,
man.
buddy.
Always enjoy having you on.
All right, guys. Thanks for having me.
Well, Bobby, guess what? You got Hey Cap this week. James.
All right.
Yeah, James Galloway emailed us at alabama@bestfishingreport.com. James is going to get 10 entries into the Sea Deck fishing ruler giveaway that we've got coming up. Folks, if y'all want to get in that Sea Deck fish ruler giveaway, just go over to greatdaysoutdoors.com/ASFR or go to the Facebook page on the left side. You'll find a subscribe tab. It's free to enter. We're going to draw on July 4th. So y'all check that out. All right, Bobby. James Galloway says, hey, Cap, what is your advice on running your boat to and through an area that you are not familiar with? There are places I want to fish, but I'm totally unfamiliar with the water there. Any suggestions would be appreciated. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if we fish and I fished on the road for many years and going to a lot of places, and I'm going through exactly what he's talking about. Growing up down here, I just don't even think twice about it. Obviously, I always tell everybody, if I even have my bottom machine on here, which is rare. A lot of times I forget to even turn it on. I can tell you within a foot of how deep it is in most of the rivers around here, and I know what he's going through. I mean, I feel exactly what he's going through because we go to places from South Florida to South Texas. And one of the best things you can get is right off the bat, the charts you can get, whether they be electronic charts or paper charts, are extremely accurate. They really are really accurate as far as bars and obstructions and water depths and that sort of thing. So I would definitely get your hands on something like that. He may be more technically competent than I am, which ain't really saying a whole lot, but online you can get a lot of information that way. Probably the most important advice I could give him though is just, if you're not sure, you got to be careful, man. You got to kind of, if you start getting outside of the channels from wherever it is that you launch, you just have to slow down a little bit. I remember one guy was telling me, he goes, yeah, I got a problem. I've been running around with my bottom machine doesn't read when I get over 50 miles an hour. I was going like, man, if you go over 50 miles an hour, you don't know how deep it is. You don't need to be running a boat anyway. You know what I'm saying? So a lot of it's going.
So that gives me anxiety.
I know it. If
I don't know where I'm at, I'm going about 1.3 miles an hour.
And that's the other piece of advice I was going to give, man. If you don't know, you got to slow down, keep an eye on that bottom machine, start getting comfortable with the area that you're fishing. Cause the most important thing is being safe. You don't want to hurt yourself. You don't want to tear your equipment up. And, so you got to kind of be safe. So that'd probably be the first thing I'd tell you. But I guess as far as like going out and trying to do it, is I would probably try to, get as much information as you can in the form of electronic maps and paper maps and study those a little bit. It doesn't hurt sometimes if you want to start getting focused on an area, whether it be the Delta area or which is a tricky area to fish until you learn it, or the southern end of the bay, particularly down the Sound where I fish a lot. get somebody to take you and tell them, hey, look, I don't want your fishing spots. I just want to know how to get around. I want to fish a little bit. But if you could kind of just show me around a little bit and just show me how to get from point A to point B and so forth, don't be afraid to do it. Most of the guys will do it. I'll do it. You know what I'm saying? If the guys tell me that, I'm like, man, we've hired guides, in places like South Florida, some of those real treacherous places, or South Texas is a tough place to fish. And, you get a guy and just going to go like, man, we just need to get from here to there or whatever, and a guy, if we're going to catch a fish, that's great too. But we're, from a navigational standpoint, that's what our main goal is at this point. So, don't be afraid to do that. Shoot, a lot of guys, I'll do it. Like I said, I'll do it. And a lot of guys will do it. Just tell us what you want to do, And so, that's a few different things you can do. But the most important thing is, Butch, like you just said, just be careful, man. You got to do it. If you're not familiar with the area, and we've all seen everybody do it. We've all probably done some things like this, but we've seen people doing it. Just jump in the boat, fire it up, run straight across so-and-so mud flat, and or oyster bar or whatever, and either getting hurt or tearing something up, or least of all, at least embarrassing yourself if nothing else. So
yeah,
you just got to be careful.
It's easy to do, man. It's easy to do,
It
especially
is,
around here as dark as
yeah.
the water is.
Embarrassment is a best case scenario in that situation.
That's the best case scenario, is just to embarrass yourself.
Yeah. Well, and I lived in Jacksonville for a while, and over there
which is a tricky place, which is extreme. That's another place. Yeah.
Because we don't get that big, huge tide like they get over there. And
that's right.
I think Virginia Beach, same way. Crazy tide. You get 4 or 5 or 6 foot swing.
I believe when I first started fishing over there, I want to say I took the boat out 4 or 5 times with no fishing rods on it and just rode around. I just rode around, and looked, and I would try to go on low tide when the sun was high, when I could get those days. And that way I knew, because the way I looked at it was, if I know where things are on dead low,
that's worst case scenario.
That's worst case scenario.
Yep.
That's right.
That's right, and that's a good way to do it. And then on that too is when you're doing that with the you don't have to spend a whole lot of money on a piece of electronics now. They all have I call them breadcrumb trails. They all have tracking on them, and you run your track, and I'm safe to go from here to here to here, and you can save that track and leave you a little track on there, and you can always follow that. And then as you want to, as you start to, get a little bit braver or whatever, you can start veering off of that or idling off of that. So, you can get back to it, and Jacksonville and you guys, like you said, on that East Coast, that was one of the places that was scarier to us than anything, because we'd go through a place, at high tide and go like, oh my God, we just ran over that gigantic mound of oyster shells, and, just not knowing, so that's what you have to do though. Is you have to get out there, like you said, and just, you have to putt around sometimes. It takes a little patience, to be able to do that. But, and just save those tracks too. If you can save those tracks and use them, you can always delete them later, but, save those tracks and get around with those. That's big thing up in the Delta, man, is holding on to those tracks too, I
love my breadcrumbs. I use them
every time I go
anywhere, really.
Yes,
I like that about my machine, that it does that. So I like it. It's great advice. And I agree.
That's a great question from James Galloway. James, thanks for emailing us that question. All right, buddy. Well, thanks a lot. We enjoyed it. Well, as always, look forward to talking to you again soon.
All right, guys. Y'all have a great weekend.
Captain Bobby, we have a Hey Cap question for both of you guys this week. I would like to get both of your inputs on it. All right, guys. Wesley Newberry emailed us at alabama@bestfishingreport.com. Wesley says, hey, guys, love the show. I've learned a lot. This question is more for the inshore guys. When you're fishing live bait, like Captain Bobby and I were talking about, we talked about this a few weeks ago. When you're fishing live bait like croakers or pogies, is it better to have a set amount of line out or to open the bail and watch when line leave? I'm going to go ahead and say that he's referring to free lining.
Yeah, tight lining or free. Yeah. Just basically fishing. I'm assuming he's asking about, fishing a fin fish of kind like a croaker or a pogie without a cork on it. So sure. I call it tight line. You can call it free line or whatever. I think we're on the same page there. But great. Yeah, it's I we talked about this a few weeks ago, and when I'm fishing and I fish a lot of croakers. Not as much pogies. I do fish with pogies occasionally, but mainly croakers when I'm using a fin fish. And like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, I leave my rod in the rod holder. I put the rod out when I got a current situation and hook the croaker just through the top lip, throw it out there. And I like to, and to his question too, I throw it out there I throw the croaker out there, and usually I'll go ahead and pay out some lines just to let it float, kind of let him swim away from the boat, then lock it in gear and stick it in the rod holder, because I don't want him right underneath the boat. You know what I'm saying? So when I make a cast, I cast as far as I can, without throwing him off, and then stick the rod in the rod holder. But then I lock it in gear and stick the rod in the rod holder and just let the croaker do the work. The croaker, the hook, and the rod do the work.
So you let Rodney do the fishing for you.
Yeah, I love
Rodney
that,
rod holder.
man. I'm going to use
Rodney rod holder.
that. I do. That's it. Rodney. And Rodney is a pretty dadgum good fisherman. He don't miss them very often.
Yeah, that's right.
I would have to concur with that in many situations.
Patrick?
Well, I would have to say that using live pogies, you better have that rod in your hand. There's occasions where letting Rodney hang on to it and that trout chases the pogie down and smashes it. But the main thing is like a pogie, that dude is always swimming. He never slows down. He's always swimming. So if you rod holder a pogie, what you're going to do is exactly what would happen if you tied your dog to a tree. You tie a dog to a tree, the dog's going to go around that tree until he can't go anymore. So the pogie's going to do the same thing. He's going to go around in circles. He's going to wrap around the trolling motor, the big motor, the power poles, everything that thing can wrap around.
Great.
And you are going to have a giant mess. So if you're fishing live pogies, freeline style, you better have the rod in your hand and not rod holder hardly ever. So I would have to I would agree with Bobby that there's a time that Rodney can take care of it, but fishing a live pogie, Rodney is not a good option.
Not a good candidate.
Boy, and I can see yeah, I can see exactly what he's talking about, man. I can just picture that, you got a fish like that too, and that's just gonna, like, he just hit the nail on the head. I mean, that fish, those pogies are especially a little bit more powerful fish, a little bit bigger fish. He's gonna move around so much, and I can just picture that going on, and I know what he's talking about. And you're fishing pogies without a weight, pretty much, isn't that right, Patrick?
Yeah, just straight up a hook.
Yeah, so you're fishing straight, so if I'm fishing a croaker, I'm going to put enough weight on him to get him down to the bottom, because that's where they're natural looking. Whereas pogies, as we've seen, it doesn't matter how deep it is. They can be on the surface, they can be mid depth, they can be on the bottom, so they look real natural. Where with a croaker, you got to get him on the bottom. So by putting that weight on there, he's not going to be able to do what you're talking about with a pogie, and I can see that.
True.
And and taking it a step further too, when we're using, when I'm using some bigger baits, particularly like pogies, like he's talking about, or even big croakers, where I take the weights off of them. If I'm in a really light current or no current situation, you can take a big, healthy 6-inch croaker, and he doesn't need a weight to get to the bottom. You can just put a hook in his mouth, and I like to do that when I don't have a lot of current. And in that case, like Patrick's talking about, that's a case where I actually may want to hold the rod in my hand. And I'll leave with a spinning rod. You can just leave the bail open, or I use a casting reel and just leave the reel out of gear, because when you're fishing a bigger bait like that, those fish sometimes, even a big trout sometimes has to get that bait turned in his mouth in order to get it to go down, which puts the hook in position to actually get the hook into the fish. You know what I'm saying? So, there is applications to where you could go either way. You know what I'm saying? And man, it's a great question that he asked. There's a couple different ways you can do it. And he's probably really confused right now, but I guess probably to sum it all up, to sum it all up is, if you're in a current situation, and you're wading bait, you're better off maybe to stick it in the rod holder with the tail hook. Whereas if you're using a free swimming bait, like you're talking about a pogie, you may be better off just to manage that bait particularly, or to feel the bite. Have it in your hand.
Yep. Well, Bobby, I want to ask one question that some of our listeners may be thinking about is, if you're talking about dunking a 6-inch croaker in the water and you're going to wait on that bait to get hit and get the hook set, and I know what you're talking about. Like, a lot of times those fish will hit it and they're going to take off running. Do you have any, I mean, is it totally feel? Do you have a set, like, I'm going to give it a 5-second count, a 10-second count? What's kind of a rule of thumb there if you're using a big bait and a trout picks it up? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have it. It's not very long. It's not 10 seconds, and it's probably not even 5. I probably have to count it off in my head, because what happens when they hit that bait, you feel it. You'll feel that, and that's when you know he's got it in his mouth. And usually I'll kind of I start to let line off, but I also start to drop the rod to the water. So however long it takes to go from like almost a vertical position with the rod with your thumb on the line, allowing the line to go off to let the rod tip almost fall to the water, throw the reel in gear, and then you can go ahead and, come tight on the line. And like, when I say come tight, I don't like to set the hook, because a lot of times you can pull, if you just kind of load up on it, you can feel if the fish has a hook, has the hook in them. And a lot of times if you load up on them, you'll feel the bait kind of come out. But if you haven't, and I'm doing air quotes here, but if you haven't set the hook, you can just drop that reel right back out of gear, and that fish will come back and get it, Yep. So however long it takes for me to go vertical down to the water, almost touching the tip to the water, that's about all I give them. You know what I'm saying? Because that fish, he's swimming, he's swimming away with that bait, and he's using that water to force that. He's already turned it in his mouth, and he's using it to force it down, that water. So it's all that stuff happens real fast for the fish, And so, but if you jerk that, if you, again, here's the air quotes, set the hook, and you jerk that fish out of his mouth without getting the hook in it, a lot of times, like or that fish or another one that's nearby will come right back and get it. So I don't like to set the hook. So it's not I don't give them a whole lot of time. Just enough to kind of let it get turned around and him start swimming with it.
Very cool. I'd have to echo that as well. I don't give them a tremendous amount of time. So
they're real good. They're real good at getting those fish down into their mouth. I mean, they're really, really good at it. You don't have to let them keep eating. That's how those bigger trout that are eating those kind of fish, that's how they're getting big. So that's because they've gotten really good at eating those big baits.
All right, well, Captain Bobby, that's an awesome report as always. Thanks for that Hey Cap question, Wesley. You guys make sure and get those in at Alabama at bestfishingreport.com.
Let's go talk with Captain Richard Rutland and Captain Patrick Garmison.
All right, man. You guys, we're going to ask both of you guys the Hey Cap question this week. This week's Hey Cap question is brought to us by Foster Contracting. The recent thunderstorms that have been producing wind and hail in the area, and the 50-mile-an-hour winds that we had 2 nights ago, goodness gracious, may have damaged your home's roof. The certified roofing pros at Foster Contracting offer free roof inspections, and if your roof has received damage, most homeowners will have little or no cost out of pocket when going through your insurance. If you're looking for quality construction with a dependable, licensed, and certified fortified roofing professional, give the Fortified Roofing Pros a call at 251-973-9999. They're a family-owned business that is big enough to get the job done, but small enough to care. Remember to support the local businesses that make your local podcast possible each week, and check them out at fortifiedroofingpros.com. All right, this week, guys, John Dixon says, Hey, Cap, when cruising up to a pilot or crab trap for triple tail, what depth of the water column should you have your bait?
Let's start with Captain Patrick. What do you think, Patrick? What's your go-to depth on triple tail? And it's a 2-part question. He's talking about pilings, and in that is buoy. I'd say buoy and buoy chains, and then crab traps. You doing things differently depending on what you're fishing?
Well, I'm gonna do, first off, most of the crab traps, I'm gonna sight fish that one pretty much exclusively. I'm gonna look for that fish, and if it's not, usually I'm just gonna keep going. As far as pilings and other structure like that, I tend to start around 4 feet, whatever the water depth is, where once it gets completely out of sight, I'll start there and maybe work my way down a little bit. But somewhere around about 6 or 7 feet is my go-to if I'm just randomly testing areas. That kind of covers it, right?
Yeah, I think it covers it. What do you think, Richard? Yeah. What's your go-to? I know you do a little something different.
Yeah, I'm with Patrick on the crab pots and floating debris and stuff. I'm always going to just be sight fishing that primarily. I'm not going to throw something down deep on something I see floating that's small. But when you go to pilings and buoys and whatnot, one little trick I have is I usually start at about 2 or 3 feet, whatever I feel like the water clarity is, and I'll usually do 2 or 3 drifts per depth. Okay. And then I usually start at 2 or 3, and then I'm going down to 4 or 5, and then I'm going down to 6 or 7. And I usually go in about 2-foot increment. And one thing I've started doing that I really think has helped is depending on your current speed that you're dealing with, something I'll do is I'll almost jig my shrimp as it's drifting by the structure, so and almost working it like a popping cork, although we're using a slip cork. And what I think that's doing is making that shrimp cover more of the water column as it's drifting by there. And you got to be careful not to do it too much, or you're going to kind of mess your drift up a little bit to kind of get it to sweep right in real tight. And that's one thing I always want my guys to do, is make sure that you're sweeping your bait real tight to that structure, because most of 9 times out of 10, they're glued to that piling or that buoy chain or whatever you're fishing that of that nature. And I feel like that's triggered a lot of bites over the time. And I'm talking about just like 2 foot, you know what I mean? You'll be drifting along and just pick your rod tip up, get tight, and go 2 foot up, and then drop it right back down. It's almost like the shrimp jumping down there, acting semi-natural and whatnot. So, but I go in 2-foot increments is usually what I like to do, because generally most of the time, Mobile Bay, Mississippi Sound, 2 to 3 feet is about the visibility. So that's why I do that.
That's interesting. What I typically do is I start at around 7 feet and will work my way down to say 9 or 10 feet but I don't necessarily do it at a given piling. I'll work my way around at 7 feet, and if I'm not getting any strikes on a piling or buoy chains or whatever I'm fishing that's stationary structure, then I'll go ahead and switch up and see if there's a trend to it. But because I feel like like you said, Richard, the visibility is say 3 feet max most times. If there's a fish that's right up underneath that buoy, or a lot of times you'll pull up to a pile and you'll see that fish come up and flash right next to it, I'm going to see that fish. So I don't feel like I need to fish that first 2 to 3 feet when I'm there. And same thing, what you just said about jigging that shrimp. If your bait is down 7 feet deep or 9 feet deep, inadvertently, as you're trying to get your bait right up next to that pile, and you're going to pull it up through the water column and most likely expose it to that fish. So I don't feel like if your bait's set at 7 or 9 feet, I feel like you are covering that water column above you. But what gets me is you guys are catching fish that y'all are seeing on your side scan 12 feet deep, 15 feet deep in some cases. You're able to see not just triple tail, but cobia too. Haven't you been able to do that, Richard? Because that's one of the things I think is a missing link for me in my fishing, is just being able to pull up to some of this structure and see what's there before I ever even have to fish it, or move on without having to fish it.
Yeah, most of the time, like with side scan, I'm usually pulling up and I'm visually inspecting what I'm looking at before I go side scanning, because you're making some noise when you're side scanning. We know, ling on one hand is a very curious fish and will come up to the boat and see what you have to offer, almost like they got their hand out. And then blackfish, on the other hand, can be, most of the time, are going to be somewhat spooky. That side scanning deal usually works for me better, on the bigger buoys out in the ship channel and whatnot, where you can, you're fishing in 30 or 40 foot of water a lot of times. But yeah, you scan right on by them. A ling looks like a log tied to the chain, and a blackfish usually looks like a spade down there. You know what I mean? Almost on your side scan, so you can usually kind of tell what you're looking at. And most of the time, your side scan gives you a side vision and down vision. If you look at your down vision, you can usually count it down and see just about what depth he's at. And you can just target that one little depth there. It'll be interesting to see in the future what happens with that, where you'll be able to get like more of a live view, almost, I guess you'd say, of where the fish is on the buoy chain or whatnot. It's going to be interesting to see where that kind of stuff goes.
as the technology increases, it's going to be a game changer. And like triple tail fishing in Mobile Bay is just going to become. You're just going to see these boats just driving by all the stuff. They're not even going to be fishing. They're just going to be driving by, looking and moving on, or fishing it if they see something. It's going to be a lot like that. Will be a lot like bass fishing in that way. You know, a lot of those guys they were really pinpoint on a school of fish. And I don't know. It's John, I hope that answered your question. It's seems like it's kind of across the board, but John's going to be getting a brand new C-Deck ruler for giving us his Hey Cap question, a CCA sponsored C-Deck ruler. Appreciate you guys being a part of the show again today.
All right,
guys. We appreciate y'all. Y'all keep whacking them.
The Hey Cap quiz this week. It's brought to us by Hilton's Offshore Charts. The days of heading out and blindly looking for good fishing areas are pretty much over. Don't waste time and money or fuel searching for fish. You need the most recent, highest resolution images to not only know where to go, but where not to go. The knowledge provided by today's technology is critical when planning an offshore fishing trip. Make the choice that professional captains all over the Gulf make and choose Hilton's Real-Time Navigator. The easy-to-use interface and excellent customer service will have you on the fish every time you go. Check it out at hiltonsoffshore.com. Bobby, you've got the Hey Cap question this week.
I like this question.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a timely question. Chase Mosley says, Hey Cap, at what water temperatures and salinity do we start to see more trout and redfish push back into the river?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, especially for this time of year, because that transition is going to start to happen. Well, right now we're over 75, and you're up in the low 80s in some places, mid 80s, depending on where you're fishing, which is the summertime pattern. You're going to be stuck with that until at least mid-October. It's going to be over 75. And at that point is when it starts to drop under 75, you'll start to see this transition of these fish moving from the bay to the river systems. So the 75 degree number is kind of a number to watch for. Usually, again, you never know around here, man. It could be late October. It could be early. If we get some early cold fronts, it could be early October. But 75 degrees seems to be the magic number. When it starts to drop under that, that's when you'll start to see some fish start to move into the river systems. Not truly like load up in the river systems. It's kind of a transitional thing. You'll see them start to show up the mouths of the rivers, the flats adjacent to the mouths of the rivers, that sort of thing, because that shrimp migration will be that way. The key to this whole bay system is a shrimp migration, and that's what starts to happen. That, and then the second part of his question was asking about salinity. Usually it's got to be, about 15 parts per thousand. I don't measure salinity actually with a hygrometer. You could do that if you wanted to. I just watch the foam in my wake, and I know that doesn't sound real technical, but I can look at the foam in my wake and tell if I'm in salty enough water to catch trout. I know that's, you could dip. If you want to get real technical, you could dip and do all that. You really, to get the true salinity, you'd have to actually drop that hygrometer down deep to find out what the true salinity is. So that's what I use. When it starts to get down to 62 degrees, which is usually about early December, around December 1st, that's when they're all in the rivers. That's when everything's made that full transition, and we go into what I call a wintertime pattern, and that's when it's, the water temperature gets down to 62 degrees. By then we've had a freeze, usually. Again, you never know around here, but by then we've usually had a hard freeze. We've had a lot of cold nights. The days get shorter, so there's a lot less sunshine on the water all day. And so you'll see that water temperature really start to drop. So 62 is the real magic number. That's when I don't waste any time outside the rivers. I'm in the rivers, every day and never going outside the river. So, you'll just to kind of sum it up, you'll start to see a transition mid-October when it starts to fall under 75, and the true end of that transition is going to be, probably early December when the water temperature gets to 62 degrees.
Bobby, I want to key in on something you were talking about when you're talking about that transition into the river systems. I'm pretty good. Once you get them corralled and pinned up in there, I'm pretty good with them there. But where I struggle is you mentioned fishing the flats outside of those river systems, and that's where I'm lost. So when those fish are staging on those flats, talk to me about presentation, and then talk to me about how you're fishing it. Are you using your trolling motor? Are you using your power poles? How exactly are you fishing those flats?
that's the kind of thing that we're doing, in the spring and the fall. That's that transitional period there. And when I said outside, but there's flat, when I say, I'm talking about that flats outside it, both inside and outside the river. So what you'll see is, places where there's shallow flats that are adjacent, depending on what river system you're in. Sometimes they can be 2 miles wide. Sometimes they may be a couple hundred yards wide, but there's shallow flats that run adjacent to the river channels. In other words, the river runs through those flats, and then on the edges of it, there's flats. Those places like Delvan Bay, Dog River is a real classic example where you have a channel running all the way up the river and flats on both sides. That's the kind of places I'm talking about, both inside and outside the river. And as far as like what I do, that's topwaters early in the morning, slick lures early in the morning. On into the day, that's the deal where you're looking for those, in the fall particularly, you start to see these birds diving on shrimp that are being chased to the surface, and that all occurs on those type of those flats too. And those are the kind of places where you're looking for slicks, trout slicks, shiny spots on the water, and getting upwind from them with your popping corks or your slick lures or anything you throw, But that's what I'm doing then. And when you hit those schools, you're either drifting with the wind or kind of drift trolling with the trolling motor. When you hit those schools, that's when you're dropping your power poles, and you'll sit there, and that's when you can get on a real whack fest. So that's what you're doing in those transitional periods.
I love it.
That's all fairly shallow water fishing too. You're talking about those places I just mentioned to you that are classic examples of what I'm talking about. You're talking about water depths in the 2 to 5 foot range.
Yeah, it's important you bring that up, because for folks that are listening that are used to hearing about flats, they're thinking about like flip pallet on the
No.
On the
18 inches of water.
Boat, poling across.
We don't have that kind of fishery here. You know what I'm saying? So,
we got redneck flats around here.
Yeah,
Alabama
great.
flat.
Right. Hey JoJo, that's gonna stick. Butch, that's gonna stick.
Redneck
flat fishing. Yeah, that's blue collar flat fishing. That's exactly right. Shallow
blue
water
collar flats fishing.
I just picked up my new Skeeter, and we were talking about that. And he said, and my Skeeter rep was telling me, we can, I think you'll be able to run in about 12 inches of water. But let me tell you something in Alabama. If I'm in 12 inches of water, I've made a mistake.
We got a problem.
I'm not where I'm supposed to be, because I don't, no need to fish in 12 inches of water in Alabama. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I've made a wrong turn or something if I'm in 12 inches of water,
That's for
sure. We're talking about those depths,
Well, Bobby, as always, buddy, we sure enjoyed having you on, and thanks for the report. If folks want to get in touch with you at A-Team Fishing, book something, you got a few dates open in September. Well, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, September is open. I'm starting to book up pretty good for later in the fall and winter, but September's open, and the easiest way to get us is just on the website, which is A-Team Fishing, like the old Mr. T show, ateamfishing.com, and there's a contact us tab that's got all the contact information. Can I go back real quick to the Hey Cap question? Because I think I left off one thing that's important that I want to mention about Chad's questions.
Yeah,
when we were talking about salinity. Real quick, I just want to touch one thing on salinity. The true barometer of salinity in our river systems, if you really just want to get something, you don't use a hygrometer, you don't want to use the high-tech hygrometer or the low-tech bobby and the foam in the wake. Just look at the pool at Berry Steam Plant. If it's under about 5 feet, there's plenty of salinity in all of our local rivers. So just keep your eye on that pool right there. It's 5 feet is kind of the magic number. Typically in the fall and even in the early part of the winter, you'll see that number being down in the 2 and 3 and 4 foot range.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry about that. I wanted to make sure I got touched on
you're
that.
Good.
No, that's great. That's great. All right.
Yep.
Well, thank you,
good
sir.
Question.
We will we'll talk to you again soon.
Hope so. Sounds good, guys. Thanks.
All right, Captain Bobby, keep whacking them.
This week's Alabama Saltwater Fishing Report has been brought to you by CCA Alabama. Pick up your distinctive Alabama saltwater fishing license plate at revenue.alabama.gov.
Also brought to you by
Geico. Call Ron Davis, Geico agent at 251-445-0053 or visit him online at geico.com/mobile-al.
And also brought to you by Daycool Heating and Air, your home performance specialist. Contact them at 251-260-3858 or check them out online at www.daycoolair.com. License number AL07028.
This week's Saltwater Fishing Report is brought to you by Angelo Depaola, the Coastal Connection with eXp Realty, your boating and beach property specialist. Check me out on Facebook at Angelo Depaola Realtor, The Coastal Connection, or call me direct at 850-287-3440.
This is Captain Richard Rutland, and this report is brought to you by Cold Blooded Fishing. You can find us at www.coldbloodedfishing.com.
And also brought to you by Fishbites. Fishbites stay on the hook longer than any natural bait. Check them out at fishbites.com.